Welcome, Vicken Cheterian. We will start this seminar with you presenting the fact that many countries have not acknowledged and recognized the genocide of the Armenians 100 years ago, and also other groups in the Ottoman Empire. And we will after that have a discussion with Linde, spokesperson in the parliament for the Left Party, and you and me. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. So the genocides in plural that happened in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, it continues to be a subject of denial. It's not a question of a necessity for historical discussion, because even during the genocide itself, the events were very well documented. For example, in Britain in 1916 there was a commission of historians set up where Toynbee, the famous British historian, at that time a young historian, he was one of the key researchers, and they have documented from eyewitnesses, from available documents at the time, and published the Blue Book. Jonathan Lepsius, the priest in Germany, who knew the Ottoman Empire and its minorities well, during the war he also documented, and he sent his reports to German politicians during the First World War. Armenians have done enormous work to document what was happening. Andonian, one of the survivors, a journalist from Istanbul, who was deported. While being deported in Syria, where a war is taking place today, in Meskene, in Deir ez-Zor area, in Aleppo, he documented himself from survivors, but also from Ottoman officers, the planned nature of the genocide. In Russian Armenia, intellectuals collected eyewitness accounts from survivors, from refugees. And after the war in Istanbul, the Armenian Patriarchate established a commission to also document. So even during the war, we have enormous documentation from the Armenian side. Ottoman Turks themselves documented the genocide. After the war, when the Young Turk Committee of Union and Progress were defeated, the new administration there in 1919 made trials to judge those criminals, because they considered that those war criminals had caused enormous damage to the Ottoman Empire, and they brought them to justice. So we have the Istanbul trials with huge documentation. So we know what happened in the past. It's not a question of not knowing. It's a question of politicians considering this crime to be not a crime. First, Turkey for many years tried to impose silence on the genocide of the First World War. I consider silence even more harmful than denial, because when you are keeping silent, it means that you have such a collaboration on the international level that you don't even need to deny. But starting from 1965, when there was enormous mobilization worldwide among Armenians, first of all, but later on Assyrians, Pontic Greeks also started mobilizing to demand recognition first and justice. So Turkey started following a policy of denial, and the denial thesis is very simple. First, it says that nothing happened. In fact, it wasn't genocide, it was just relocation of population. But those populations relocated never got the right to go back. And then they say, well, this relocation was done because those populations were rebellious, so we had to relocate them. Okay, there's many problems with this concept. Now, one point I want to make about Western powers. Turkey could not have continued to deny the genocide without Western powers playing the game. Without the US, without European powers, without major European powers like Britain, Germany, but also Israel. Let's not forget about Israel, which is a state itself guarding the memory of another genocide. Still, in the case of the Armenian genocide, Assyrian genocide, Pontic Greek genocide, Israel is a negationist state. So in case we don't have a series of states collaborating with Turkey, on the question of negation, it would not work. And the last way of negating the genocide is saying, well, something happened, but we don't know what happened. So let's make a commission to study about it. And this position for me poses two new questions and two new problems. First, in case we cannot qualify what happened 100 years ago, and this is not a minor issue. We are talking about, accumulating the Greeks, Assyrians, Armenians killed. It's probably over 2 million people killed. Another 2 million people deported. Their properties confiscated. So it's a major issue. It's not like a minor detail in history where we need to go to the archives and verify. So in case history cannot tell us what happened on this scale, why do we write history books? Why do we teach history at universities? We can't make use of it in case after 100 years we still have to debate. But the second problem, which is even more powerful and more painful, is what is the message we are sending to victims of massacres and deportations taking place today in the Middle East? What are we telling to the Syrians? What are we telling the Iraqis? What are we telling to the Palestinians? What are we telling to the Yazidi Kurds? We are telling them, it's okay you're suffering, we will document it, and maybe 100 years later we will discuss whether this was something bad or it was your fault what happened. And this is horrible. In case this is the message we are sending to civilian victims of wars today, then the message is wrong. We have to make correction there.
Thank you, Vicken Cheterian. I would like to welcome Hans Linde, spokesperson of the Left Party, up on stage. And the microphone for you. Yes, thank you, Vicken. This is very interesting. You have mentioned the fact that the silence is even worse than the denial, and the fact that the Armenian genocide is actually questioned today by the Swedish government, which is the fact. You, Hans Linde, you are actually in the parliament, and you were part of the process when the Swedish parliament called for the recognition. What is your comment to this?
Well, I remember in 2010 when we had this process in the Swedish parliament, which ended with the Swedish parliament passing a statement with one vote saying that what happened in 1915 was a genocide of Armenians, Assyrians, Syriac, Chalaic, and the Pontic Greeks. And I remember people asking me, why are you discussing this in the Swedish parliament? And I think actually Vicken already has answered that question. Why is it important today, in 2015, to continue on to discuss this issue? First of all, because it is still an open wound. I actually used exactly that word in the parliament in 2010. It's still an open wound for all the children and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the survivors. And we should remember that thousands of them live today in Sweden. They are part of our history, part of our country, part of our culture, and their history is our history today. But also, the second argument, as also that Vicken said, is that it's important to learn from history to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself. There's a really famous story about when the Nazis in Germany in the end of the 30s were planning the Holocaust. And people were saying, well, what will be the verdict of history if we do this, and won't people protest? And Adolf Hitler is said to have said that, who remembers Armenians today? And that actually put the fingers on the problems today. If we deny what happened in 1915, then we're sending a clear signal to those who are committing genocide today that you have a chance to be forgotten. You can, just, step into the shadows of history, and we can forget what you are doing. And I think that's extremely dangerous, especially if we look at the situation right now in Syria and in Iraq.
But still it was controversial. You said it passed with one vote, the call for recognition. Why is it so controversial to recognize the Armenian genocide and other groups, I would like to add?
Well, of course, there was a lot of formal arguments in our debate, and the formal arguments from the previous government and for the current government that so far has not been willing to pass a recognition. They're talking about, you know, the unclear judicial aspects. They're talking about this is a debate for historians, etc., etc. I think those are fake arguments, and the presentation we heard here also showed that's really not really, you know, any valid arguments. I think the real arguments are more about realpolitik. They are looking to the Swedish relations to Turkey. What would be the consequences of a Swedish recognition? Of course, it would cause, you know, turmoil and some, you know, problems with Turkey. Turkey probably will withdraw their ambassador from Sweden for a couple of weeks, perhaps a month. But I think in the end it will be back to normal. I think also, I must be honest, I feel more and more that it's more also a domestic issue in Sweden. The Armenian community is quite small in Sweden, it's very small, but we have a quite big Turkish, a quite big Kurdish, and a quite big Assyrian community in Sweden. And of course that makes it a bit sensitive. If you look, for example, at the Social Democrats that's now in power, historically they have had a strong support among the Turks in Sweden. I think they are, you know, a bit worried. What would happen, you know? Will they, you know, will the Turks in Sweden continue on voting for the Social Democrats if they really pass a recognition? So it's very much realpolitik, I would say.
This is very interesting. Those Armenians, maybe 3,000-4,000 Armenians that live in Sweden today, what would you expect the reaction from them and also from Armenians outside of Sweden on the fact that the government has now put an expert group to look into the issue? Was there a genocide? Should we actually recognize the genocide in Sweden and so on? What will be the consequences of this open wound, so to say, again?
I mean, for the Armenian survivors, as well as the other groups, Assyrians, Assyro-Chaldeans, the Pontic Greeks, and I understand that there's an important Assyrian community in Sweden. For them, it's like not recognizing they were victims. In case they were not victims, what were they? Then not only they will feel victimized in the past, but also that they are out of any system of justice, even in Sweden, their suffering is not recognized. But for me, the worst message being sent is to the Kurdish and Turkish community, because of course they are Turkish nationalists, but this is not the only political culture and model that exists among Turks and Kurds. There are others. So it depends on the Swedish politicians which type of Turkish political culture they want to be associated with, and which type of political culture among migrant communities they want to encourage. Is it a political culture where we deny genocide? Then up to where can we tolerate that? I mean, where to put the limits? It's a very dangerous one. We know the history of Europe. We are not just talking about the history of Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And I think in the past, Western powers have done enormous mistakes by saying that it is okay to forget. More than that, we said that this Turkey, which modern Turkey built on massacres, deportations, confiscation of private property. This is sacrosanct in Europe, right? Private property massively stolen. That not only this is okay, but for many decades we said that this is model for development for other third world and specifically Muslim states. I mean, there's so many problems with this policy that we carried. Not only not to encourage Turkey to choose reform, positive reforms, but also to say that crimes are models for others to follow. I mean, it is horrible. It is shocking for me.
And this expert group that the government put, and those fake arguments that you mentioned, how do you interpret this fact that the government the Swedish government is pushing this in another direction than the Swedish Parliament actually set out in 2010?
We have a similar discussion in Switzerland, very typical, between the legislative recognizing and wanting to face this part of history, but also take position in the current debate, and the executive wanting to please Ankara and strategic interests. And this poses also problems within Western democracies. I mean, in what type of legal system are we living? Do parliaments matter, or can the executive hijack parliamentary decisions by doing the contrary? So it poses not only questions on the past, on other societies, on the Middle East, but it also poses central questions about the way Western democracies function today.
Hans Linde, do you know anything about this actual expert group that the government has put now? And Margot Wallström, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, she actually announced that it will not be a long process. This expert group will be ready with its conclusions already this year, looking into the genocide of Armenians and the other groups in the Ottoman Empire.
Well, I must be totally honest, I have very little information about this expert group. We haven't received any information actually to the Parliament about their work, but I expect it to be a very short process, because, you know, to be honest, if you look at the global community and if you listen to the researcher and the academics, there's already a consensus. There's no discussion going on about if this was a genocide or not. There's a consensus, and the judicial situation is very clear. There's no grey zones here, so I expect it to be a very short process. And of course, you should remember when we passed our statements in the Parliament in 2010, all the Social Democrats, all the Greens, all their MPs voted in favor of this recognition when they were in opposition. So I hope it will be a matter of time before they will get a clear message from the Swedish government.
As far as I understand, it's very much about the terminology here, actually using the term genocide. Is that a key terminology that we need to use on the slaughter of the Armenians, the Greeks, the Caledonians, the Assyrians, and all the other groups in the Ottoman Empire? Or would that be open for some kind of other terminology? Why is this so important in the recognition?
I think that the whole debate was hijacked around the usage of terminology. And for me, the debate is not a legal debate. Legal specialists, legal experts can find solutions. The only issue is that legally the Convention on the Genocide comes from 1948, while we are talking about events that happened earlier. But the Convention is based on the events that took place, and specifically the Armenian and Assyrian genocide. So, okay, we can, on the legal level, debate about how to qualify. But for me, the most important is the political usage of this debate. And politicians are using the screen to hide the fact that they are not taking responsibility of the events. Both in Sweden, so in case you are a Swedish politician and you don't want to take responsibility, you say, let's make a commission and debate about it. The same thing is happening in Turkey. In Turkey, what they are saying is that what happened, we don't know what happened, so we don't want to take responsibility as a state, and there are so many elements to face when you take responsibility. There are hundreds of thousands of people who were forcibly converted, and up to today, they have problems of being acknowledged as grandchildren of people who in 1915 they were converted as orphans. We have thousands of property confiscated, and up to now the legal status of these churches, churches, monasteries belonging to a family in a village in Turkey. How come? How come a Kurdish family owns a church? So they stole it. And so in case you are a state that do not want to face those political responsibilities, you say, aha, there's a debate, let's hide behind the debate.
Final question to you two. Hans Linde, how will you pressure this issue further? You are actually in the parliament. you're a very important VIP person in terms of foreign politics here. What will you do next on this issue?
Well, of course, it's important to put pressure on the government to ensure that they really keep their promise that they had in the election campaign a year ago. But it's also important not to see only the question about recognition. For me, it's important now to start looking at how can we include the question about the genocide in what we teach in school, in the history classes. How can we ensure that we study this more in our universities? There are a number of different other steps that we need to take a look at. And just me at the end by saying, you know, the terminology genocide is really important here, I would say. I remember, you know, Mr. Carl Bildt, our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, he used the term tragedy. He talked about the Armenian tragedy over and over again. And, you know, and the Estonia accident, that was a tragedy. The tsunami was a tragedy. But when a state kills 1.5 million persons, men, women and children, that's not a tragedy, that's a genocide. And I remember meeting so many, you know, children and grandchildren of the survivors. For them it was really a slap in the face. For them, you know, the words of Mr. Carl Bildt just kept, you know, their wound opened for just, you know, some more time.
Thank you. Vicken Cheterian, what would be your message to the Swedish politicians on this issue, now looking and working in this expert group? What would you like them to carry with them in their, you know, future steps in the issue of the genocide recognition?
My message would be first to have courage, and second to understand the political dimension of what they are doing. We are not just talking about the past. We are not talking about those who died. We are talking about us, about what kind of society we want to live in. We want to live in a society where we can forget crimes and pretend they didn't happen. And let us not forget that we are still living with the same challenges as before. 20th century was a century of crime. Let us build a different 21st century.
Thank you. That was a nice concluding word.